And so what I'm going to talk about just for the next few minutes is about the idea of competition and the way that competition as a sort of democratic ideal bears on the problems that we're having in thinking about digital democracy or thinking about our politics in an age of digital transformation. And competition is one of these central and sort of basic concepts across a whole range of social sciences, but it's of particular salience in thinking about democracy, where some of the most canonical definitions of modern democracy turn on competition. I'm thinking of Joseph Schumpeter, but the idea of party competition, rotation of office, of these being foundational to some aspect of modern democracy. And even the most radical Democrats, most of the most radical Democrats at least, right? Most of the most radical Democrats even would hold that there is something indispensable about that idea of competitive party-organized electoral politics to the very idea of a democracy. But competition is also central to a whole different line of democratic thinking, which is about the public sphere and one that's rooted in ideas about a marketplace of ideas. Right? And this idea is sometimes referenced back to Mill, which is not quite right, I think, but even in people like Jürgen Habermas, right? He's drawing a lot on people like Charles Sanders Peirce, who is theorizing, how ideas develop in, he calls, an intensely competitive struggle, right? And how we then fashion islands of consensus or unity within this kind of a deeply competitive society. So there are these public sphere locations of ideas. And of course, most obviously and most basically, competition is there in ideas about economic organization. And although each of these sorts of sites of thinking about competition are very different, they each have some commonalities and some common roots in an ideal about a kind of choosing subject, about individuals being empowered to make choices in the ideas that they take up, the products or services they buy, the ways in which they select who they're ruled by, and that these are free from sort of coercion and inappropriate influence. And so when I think of then, to come to the second bit of my comments, about our problems in the digital age, these three sort of sites of thinking about competition and the ways that they can be problematic all sort of come together and kind of interweave in very complicated ways. So one way in which competition becomes problematic is in the infrastructure of the public sphere. And this is something that's already been touched on, but it's a frequent criticism of Facebook, Google, that they are monopolies, and that they're monopolies in a particular kind of way, that because they're platforms and because of network effects, they've achieved a kind of de facto monopoly within their areas, which gives them an enormous influence. And one commentator, Jack Balkin, has said, look, the questions we need to ask here are about political economy. Right? How does our political and economic system pay for a digital public sphere? If we pay for it through digital surveillance, this is, he thinks, a very problematic route, right? It's going to be paid for by making money out of personal data, but if we're not going to pay for it that way, we need to think positively about how we might. So questions about the infrastructure of the public sphere are ones where competition or monopoly have become deeply problematic. And then in the sort of conduct of public debate, also there's a sense that there's something deeply problematic about how competition is working. In one sense, you can say there's been a great ease of entry into public debate, ease of transmission of ideas, and a disruption of professional intermediaries, a disruption of journalistic and other professions, which the economist Ronald Coase once called self-authorizing cartels of intellectuals. Right? And this language of cartels as a sort of, and monopolies on information being broken up by these disruptive forces. These ideas are at least at work. I wouldn't want to put any strong reading of exactly which ways we've got a problem of competition here, because there are two opposite lines of anxiety, right? And one of them is that public debate is too disorganized, too turbulent, as Helen Margetts, who wrote a book called political turbulence on exactly this phenomenon. She says political turbulence is the characteristic quality of the network public sphere. Issues and movements seem to come from nowhere. You've got virality, unpredictability. Yet also there are these opposite anxieties, that actually our public debate is too organised, too polarised. It's become in some ways too fixed. So there are these kinds of anxieties about what competition means and how it works in public debate and public discussion. I hesitate to say public deliberation, a bit more of a specialised term. But also in party competition. So party competition, if we take this to be in some sense the lifeblood of modern democracy, there's the long-standing sort of anxiety about the weakening legitimacy of party systems and party politics. But then there's this question of the effects of digital politics on party competition. And they're potentially deep and profound and still very unclear. And I think in these questions of whether technologies such as micro-targeting and so on are simply the one next step in the technological struggle that's been going on since the first days of opinion polling to sort of gain the upper hand in the battle for votes. Is it just an incremental advance, or is it a change in quality that fundamentally alters our democracy? I don't know, but that's one of the questions that has to be, that comes up when we think of this. So I think competition is implicated in the problems of democracy in a digital age in pretty fundamental ways and in complicated ways. And just then to finally raise a few sort of normative questions. How long have I got? A couple of minutes. Yeah. So just to raise some sort of normative questions. I think there are, you might say, roughly three sorts of ways people might respond to competition in this area. One is to say we've got too much competition. One is to say we haven't got enough competition. And another is to say we've got the wrong sort, the wrong kind of competition. So, if we say we've got too much competition, then one argument you hear along these lines is that the problem with, say, Facebook and some of our other free online services that obviously monetize our attention, is that because they are businesses, because they are in a competitive business environment and are geared towards maximizing profit, they organize and design their platforms around that end. They don't organize their platforms around the end of productive or inclusive public discussion. And you see this in the design of forums, the online spaces, discussion spaces, comment spaces. They're geared to encourage interaction, but they have no investment in that being a democratically positive interaction. Any interaction works in terms of monetization. And so a response to this kind of we've got too much competition is to say what we need to do is somehow take these elements of the infrastructure out of this domain and not think of them in these terms. Perhaps there's been talk of nationalizing or otherwise taking platforms into public ownership or to regulate them as though they were utilities, like the water and the electric board. Or you might think of organisational forms like the BBC, public arm's length corporations. And in some sense, we might think then, okay, one solution is to pull away and say we've got too much competition and we need to somehow remove or constrain or contain these forms. Another sort of view is to say we haven't got enough competition. And this is also one that's getting some traction in various quarters across the political spectrum, right? That what we need is a revitalization. Some American legal scholars like Eric Posner and others have said we need to revitalize antitrust law. We need to dust off antitrust law since Robert Bork buried it in the 70s, and we need to come back and start applying that, breaking up these monopolies in order that we can then empower individuals. I mean, I just want to say, ironically, Friedrich Hayek actually has a good argument against monopolies. It's often forgotten. In The Road to Serfdom, there were two roads to serfdom. One of them was state planning. The other one was private monopoly. So, and then we might talk about the wrong kind of competition. So, Ian Shapiro, a political theorist, recently has said, look, We need two-party competition, legally policed, with strong judicial interventions to prevent money corrupting the system. What we don't need is more of this wild contestatory politics, or the sort of accelerated pluralism, as one scholar calls it, that you seem to get in the network public sphere. So I think I'll just leave it there then for raising these, putting a few questions on the table.
Thank you.